We should have number 1 there for introduction. While studies on Christian holiness abound in theological literature, there is a scarcity of research on the connection between holiness and the priesthood of Christ in the area of systematic theology. The present paper intends to contribute to this lacuna by articulating a constructive view of Christ's priesthood and the sanctification of believers from a biblical perspective. This tentative articulation explores the language of holiness in the Epistle to the Hebrews, where we find the only explicit elaboration of the priesthood of Christ in Scripture. And there are several occurrences of the language of sanctification of believers. In order to achieve this goal, the systematic approach will be undertaken in 2 steps. I will initially provide a descriptive reading of the sanctification of believers in Hebrews. Then, on the basis of the descriptive reading, I will outline a constructive account of Christ's priesthood and the sanctification of believers. So let's start with the descriptive reading. You can see there a discussion about the semantic language for sanctification from Lowe and Nida. I will skip this paragraph and then just say that many of these terms or expressions appear in Hebrews. And for the purposes of this paper, I have delimited the occurrences of this semantic domain in the epistle to those that refer to believers. And then I will mention other references that I will not deal in this paper. We start with the first occurrence, hagiadzo in 2:11, actually 2 occurrences of this language in this passage, and both in the present participle establish a relationship between Jesus and believers by calling him the one who sanctifies, while they are described as those who are sanctified. In the sentence that precedes the statement of 2:11, Jesus is portrayed as the pioneer / founder / author of salvation, which appears to highlight the soteriological perspective of his sanctification of believers in 2:11. It is noteworthy that these occurrences of the participial form of the verb hagiadzo in 2:11 appear precisely in the pericope that contains the first explicit reference to Jesus as high priest in the epistle, in 2:17. In fact, the New English Bible even translates the expression ho hagiadzom and hoi hagiadzomenoi in 2:11 respectively as consecrating priest and those whom he consecrates. I do not think that the addition of the term priest in the translation is necessary, but this seems to indicate that this translation underscores in 2:11 the priestly tone of the pericope. Likewise, the secondary literature emphasizes that the language of sanctification in 2:11 has cultic, priestly overtones. Harold Attridge argues that the cultic language of sanctification in this verse gives a hint of the high priestly status that results from Christ's perfection. The next occurrence of the language of sanctification or holiness in the epistle is found in 3:1, where believers are referred to by the author of Hebrews as holy brothers. Moreover, the language of hagioi qualifies believers as saints in 6:10 and 13:24, which is the last verse of the epistle. A brief comparison of these passages with the description of Jesus as high priest in 7:26 seems to indicate an interesting parallel of the language of holiness for Jesus and for the believers. In 7:26, Jesus as high priest is holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Arguably, this list clarifies the meaning of Jesus' holiness, which is different from the weaknesses of Aaronic priests. In fact, the audience, who was referred to by the language of holiness in 3:1, is also described by the language of weakness in 4:15, being dependent of Jesus' high priestly sympathy. This suggests that the holiness of believers is distinct from and dependent of Jesus' priesthood. The way in which Jesus' priesthood sanctifies believers is explained in chapters 9 and 10, which deal with the superior sacrifice of the new covenant, mentioned in 7:22 and introduced in chapter 8. In 9:13, the sacrificial blood of animals according to the Levitical order is asymmetric compared with the blood of Christ's sacrifice. Whereas the blood of such sacrifices externally sanctifies those defiled in the sense of having their flesh purified, the sacrificial blood of Christ will internally or morally purify the conscience of believers from dead works. This purification is necessary for believers to worship God. To put it more sharply, this asymmetric comparison associates the concepts of sanctification and purification slash cleansing, giving the parallel between hagiadzo and katarizo. Therefore, Christ's sacrificial blood sanctifies believers in terms of cleansing or purification. The immediate context for the purifying sanctification of the conscience of believers by means of Christ's blood describes his once-for-all entrance as a high priest into the heavenly sanctuary, precisely on the basis of his sacrificial blood. Furthermore, the context highlights the crucial role of blood in the inauguration of the first covenant, the covenantal and cultic notion that almost everything is purified with blood, and that sacrificial blood is necessary for the forgiveness of sin. Moreover, Hebrews 9:23 emphasizes the need for purification of the heavenly sanctuary on the basis of Christ's superior sacrifice. It is noteworthy that 3 out of the 4 occurrences of the verb katarizo in the epistle appear in chapter 9. These occurrences seem to suggest that the purifying sanctification of believers by means of Christ's blood is associated implicitly or explicitly with his priestly entrance into the heavenly sanctuary, the inauguration of the new covenant, the forgiveness of sins, and the purification of the heavenly sanctuary. To be sure, all these associations require further elaboration, but given the limitations of space in this paper, I will only mention them to emphasize that this sanctification takes place in the larger framework of Christ's priesthood, involving the heavenly sanctuary, the new covenant, the forgiveness of sins. Another significant point to be underscored is that the verb katarizo in 9:14 is in the future tense, which could imply that the purifying sanctification of the conscience of believers is not a past or complete event for the audience of Hebrews. I discuss other possibilities in footnote 8. It is not only the blood that is mentioned in the sanctification of believers by means of Christ's sacrificial offering. His body is emphasized as well. It is by God's will that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. In this passage, the verb hagiadzo is in the perfect participle passive form. The offering is contrasted with the repetitive offerings of Aaronic priests. While their offerings could not take away sins, Christ has perfected for all time those who are sanctified by means of his single offering. The cultic conception of perfection is also highlighted in 9:9, where the author of Hebrews argues, in opposition to what he affirms in 10:14, that sacrifices offered by Aaronic priests were unable to perfect the conscience of the worshipper. Therefore, these passages appear to indicate that sanctification is associated with the language of being perfected, in the cultic sense of taking away sins, especially from the conscience, by means of sacrifice. It is noteworthy that the language of being perfected and sanctified in 10:14 is associated with the description of the new covenant quoted from Jeremiah 31:33-34 in Hebrews 10:16 and 17. In this passage, the 2 key features of the new covenant are: 1, the Lord writing his laws in the hearts and minds of his people, and 2, the forgiveness of their sins, expressed in terms of the Lord no longer remembering them. It seems plausible to argue that the perfection and sanctification produced by Christ's sacrifice is somehow related to these 2 features of the new covenant being effected in the lives of believers. To use the language of the epistle, Christ's sacrificial blood is the blood of the covenant that produces sanctification. After the expositional material in Hebrews up to 10:18, we find the teaching about sanctification in the hortatory section of the epistle. According to 10:19-22, Jesus' sacrificial blood and his heavenly priesthood enable believers to spiritually enter the heavenly sanctuary, sanctified/purified, that is, with hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and bodies washed with pure water. This passage seems to fulfill the promised purification of Ezekiel 36:25-26, which employs the language of sprinkling, water, purification, and a new heart. The promised purification of Ezekiel is framed in terms of the vindication of God's holiness. It promotes the people's obedience to his laws and employs the covenantal language, "You shall be my people and I will be their God." Hence, Hebrews seems to combine Jeremiah 31:31-34, and Ezekiel 36:23-28 as the Old Testament theological background for understanding the sanctification of believers from a covenantal standpoint. The sanctifying purification of 10:22 holistically encompasses both the hearts and the bodies of believers. Even though in 9:13-14, the contrast between the sacrifices of animals in the first covenant and the sacrifice of Christ highlights respectively the outward purifying sanctification of the flesh and the inward purifying sanctification of the conscience. The new covenant is not restricted to an inward purification of believers. Instead, it includes the sanctifying purification of both internal and external dimensions. As Cockerill points out, the inner transformation of the heart is externally expressed in the changed conduct of an obedient body. According to his combined background reading of the New Covenant and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the purified heart is an obedient heart, since this is the heart upon which God has written his laws. In Hebrews, the cleansing of the heart is further specified as a purification of the conscience, which seems to suggest that conscience is part of the heart. Moreover, this purification of heart and body is explicitly associated with the priesthood of Christ and makes possible the spiritual entrance of believers in the presence of God in the heavenly sanctuary, probably in terms of prayer. Cockerill underscores that the language of cleansing with participles in the perfect tense in 10:22 not only indicates that Christ's past act of purification continues to enable the worshiper to enter God's presence, but also emphasizes that cleansing remains a prerequisite for entrance into the divine presence. The author of Hebrews also warns believers against the danger of profaning, making common, the blood of the covenant by which they were sanctified. This profanation seems to be described in terms of willful and persistent sin, which neutralizes the salvific effects of Christ's sacrifice for sins. Hence, even though the sanctification produced by Christ's sacrifice is able to perfect believers for all time, this sanctification can be interrupted by sinful apostasy. This contingent picture of sanctification is positively reinforced in 12:14, where the epistle encourages believers to pursue the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. The context of this passage seems to indicate that this pursuit is negatively understood in terms of not becoming defiled. Furthermore, the author of Hebrews motivates believers to endure trials for the sake of discipline. The New Jerusalem Bible emphasizes the meaning of instruction and training conveyed by the term paideia. Perseverance is part of your training. Just as in the discipline, in the sense of training, of a responsible father with his child, God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. 12:10. In other words, trials should be endured and conceived as a form of God's discipline or training, and this endurance is a necessary step for our sharing in God's holiness. When 12:7, 10, and 13, 12 and 13 are read together, these two chapters, the endurance of believers is a reflection and a result of Jesus' sacrificial endurance. In 13, 12, and 13, the author highlights that Jesus suffered outside the city in order to sanctify the people by his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp and bear the abuse he endured. Once again, Hebrews underscores the idea that believers are sanctified by Jesus' sacrificial blood. But the epistle also underlines the fact that sanctified believers endure trials, and God may even use them to make believers participate in his holiness. After this descriptive reading of the sanctification of believers in Hebrews, I will outline a constructive account of Christ's priesthood and their sanctification. So let's move now to a constructive account. In his systematic investigation of holiness and priesthood in the Hebrew Bible, Philip Jensen organizes his study according to 4 cultic dimensions of holiness, namely 1, spatial, 2, personal, 3, ritual, and 4, temporal. The spatial dimension refers particularly to the sanctuary. The personal describes the high priests and other agents involved in the priestly service. The ritual focuses on the sacrifice and other cultic activities, and the temporal dimension is especially related to calendar festivals, the Sabbath, and the Day of Atonement. Jensen argues that these categories are helpful for dealing with holiness, not merely as a conception, but more broadly as a worldview. I will borrow these 4 categories for the systematic purposes of the present section. Obviously, they will only serve to formally organize the material information gathered in the descriptive reading of the previous section. However, before I start to outline the constructive account according to these 4 dimensions of holiness, it is imperative to highlight 2 important notions identified in the previous section that need to inform the systematic discussion of the categories. First, the sanctification of believers in Hebrews assumes a covenantal framework in which they are prepared to enter into the presence of God. Second, the sanctification of believers has a cultic emphasis, which means that the focus is on the idea of cleansing. These 2 notions are elaborated in terms of Christ's high priesthood. Christ, the high priest, is the mediator of a new covenant. On the basis of his sacrifice, he sanctifies believers by purifying them. From this perspective, we will proceed to the brief constructive account of the 4 dimensions of holiness. First, the spatial dimension. From a spatial perspective, the discussion of the sanctification of believers in Hebrews initially emphasizes the importance of the heavenly sanctuary. The affirmation of the purifying sanctification of the conscience of believers by means of Christ's blood in 9:14 assumes his entrance as a high priest into the heavenly sanctuary in verses 11 and 12. This emphasis is maintained in the teaching for sanctification in the hortatory section of the epistle in 10:19 to 22, as Jesus' priesthood enables believers to spiritually enter the heavenly sanctuary inasmuch as their hearts are sanctified/purified from an accusing conscience. While in the exposition section, the passage of 9:11 to 12 describes Christ's ontological entrance into the heavenly sanctuary, in the hortatory section, the passage of 10:19 to 22 invites believers to enter the sanctuary, arguably in terms of prayer. In both cases, however, the entrance into the heavenly sanctuary has the presence of God in view, which seems to explain why the non-ontological entrance of believers still needs to be preceded by their cleansing through the mediation of Christ's priesthood. In the final hortatory section of the epistle, the author spatially underlines in 13:12 to 13 the earthly realm of Christ's sacrifice to sanctify believers by means of his blood. The location is identified as outside the city, outside the camp, which is a language of the sanctuary service in the Hebrew Bible. And the audience is rhetorically invited to come to this place of shame, as Jesus did. Believers should come to this earthly place in the midst of sufferings, as this is where the sacrifice of Jesus took place for their sanctification. At the same time, the emphasis on the heavenly sanctuary in 9:11 to 12 and 10:19 to 22 indicates that believers receive a purifying sanctification to spiritually enter the heavenly sanctuary. This is a curious interplay between the earthly and heavenly realms related to the believer's experience of holiness. 2. Now, the personal dimension. Jesus is undoubtedly the agent of sanctification in Hebrews. He is the one who sanctifies believers, 2:11. The statement appears in the pericope where Jesus is explicitly called high priest for the first time in the epistle in 2:17. As we already mentioned, Jesus as high priest is holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, 7:26. In contrast, believers are paradoxically referred to both by the language of holiness in 3:1 and of weakness, 4:15, which makes them dependent on Jesus' high priestly sympathy, 4:15. It is not noteworthy, however, that the hortatory invitation of sanctified believers to spiritually enter the heavenly sanctuary in 2:19 to 22 may suggest that they are being implicitly considered priests, inasmuch as they are called to come to God's presence in the heavenly sanctuary. But this would be a priesthood in a secondary sense, taking into account their utter dependence on Christ's unique priesthood. If this interpretation is correct, the holistic cleansing of believers with water in 10:19 to 22 could be potentially connected with the consecration of priests in the Hebrew Bible. Although purification with water was practiced in a number of cases in the Hebrew Bible, this was a particular consecrating rite for the priesthood of Aaron and his sons in Exodus 29, 40, and Leviticus 8. In short, this is a sanctifying purification for approaching God. Third, the ritual dimension. Certainly, the most emphasized priestly ritual for the sanctification of believers in Hebrews is the notion of Jesus' once-for-all sacrificial offering. His sacrificial body and blood is the means by which they are purified, sanctified. While the author of Hebrews does not seem to explain how exactly this bloody purification works from an ontological point of view, he does affirm that this is not merely a ritualistic purification. Rather, Christ's sacrifice is able to profoundly purify the hearts of believers and clean their accusing conscience. However, the reference to the sanctification of believers in 10:29 appears to imply that there is more to Christ's actions in the priestly ritual. Positively, this passage qualifies his sacrificial blood as the blood of the covenant, which arguably plays a role in the divine forgiveness of sins and the transformation of the human heart in light of the exposition of chapters 8 to 10. The transformation in view here refers to a genuine, obedient heart in the context of the new covenant of God with his people. Negatively, the problem of rebellion against God in the form of willful and persistent sin in 10:26 is described, among other things, in terms of profaning, making common, the blood of the covenant by which they were sanctified, 10:19. As a result of this problem, the author of Hebrews associates the divine judgment against apostasy in 10:27 with a negative reference to the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of Christ's sacrifice for the apostates. There no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. 10:26. This statement raises the question of what makes Christ's sacrifice effective or ineffective for human beings. A more immediate answer could focus on the presence of or the lack of faith on the part of the person. While this is an important and crucial part of the answer, the dimension of faith seems to be connected with a broader dimension. Considering that Christ's sacrifice for sins took place once for all, and thus chronologically precedes the actual response or lack of faith on the part of the audience of the epistle, we could ask what makes the benefits of the past sacrifice still available for subsequent years. According to the sanctuary rituals of the Hebrew Bible, there is no sacrificial offering disconnected with priestly mediation. The same picture seems to inform the priestly understanding of Christ's heavenly mediatorial work for salvation in Romans 8:34, Hebrews 7:25, 9:24, and 1 John 2:1 and 2. From this perspective, it is his priestly intercession in heaven that makes the benefits of his sacrifice available to forgive and sanctify, purify believers. Conversely, the rebellious attitude of apostasy described in 10:26-29 is not only a profanation of the blood of the covenant, but firstly, an extreme disdain, trampling underfoot of Christ himself in 10:19, who is the priestly mediator of the new covenant. For the purposes of this paper, the depiction of this radical experience of apostasy in 10:26-29 negatively portrays a reversal of the experience of sanctification, but positively implies the crucial and continuous priestly role of Christ's heavenly intercession in the sanctification, purification of believers, which makes the benefits of his once-for-all sacrifice effective in the lives of believers. 4. The dimension of time. The dimension of time was partially treated in the previous subsection regarding the ritual connection between sacrifice and intercession in Christ's priesthood. The sacrifice was an once-for-all event, while the heavenly intercession is an ongoing action. The sacrifice is past. The intercession makes the benefits of the sacrifice available in the present. The sacrifice provides the basis for the sanctification of believers, whereas the continuous intercession makes this sanctification effective in the lives of believers. Taking into account these distinctions, it is precisely the intercession of Christ that is contemporaneous with the prayers of believers. To use the language of Hebrews, believers approach God in prayer through him in context of Christ's intercession. Approach God, between quotations, and through him as well, in Hebrews 7:25. The dimension of time is also present in the discussion about the nature of sanctification itself. Recent studies, particularly in the area of biblical studies, have challenged the traditional definition in Protestant systematic theology of sanctification in terms of ongoing progress or gradual transformation between the event of justification and the climax of glorification. As Ben Dunson points out, this challenge does not deny that God transforms believers throughout their lives. Rather, the question is whether this process should be called sanctification. David Patterson argues that the New Testament does affirm the important process of spiritual growth. And he mentions 1 Corinthians 3, 1 Timothy 4, and Hebrews chapter 5. But he maintains that this is not expressed in terms of sanctification, not the language of sanctification. Instead, Peterson claims, with particular reference to Hebrews, that sanctification is related to the initiation of Christian life, involving forgiveness, cleansing, and the reorientation of life which must be kept until the end. This initiation is negatively spelled out in terms of separation from uncleanness, evil, and positively defined as consecration to God and to His will. It is the relationship between the initiation and the need to keep or even regain this condition throughout time that makes possible to speak of the now and the not yet of sanctification. Throughout time, there is the danger of defilement and apostasy, which are mentioned in the warnings of Hebrews. In this sense, Peterson points out, holiness is not only a gift, but a calling. This is the call to sanctified believers to live out the practical implications of sanctification, where holiness becomes a lifestyle. It is from this perspective that the final exhortations of Hebrews 13, the last chapter of the epistle, are viewed as guidelines for holy living, between quotation marks from Peterson. That is, what begins in the heart reaches all aspects of life. In contrast to the so-called positional or definitive sanctification in Christ, Michael Allen has recently defended the traditional notion of sanctification as progressive growth. Ironically, it is precisely from the book of Hebrews that he intends to broaden the discussion about sanctification. Among his arguments about the nature of sanctification, Allen highlights that Hebrews employs the language of sonship in the context of the relationship between God and believers as part of its ongoing call for not only growth but discipline. While Allen wants to elaborate on this point in light of Israel in the wilderness, I suspect that this idea has the potential to be further explored in the New Testament itself. In the descriptive reading of Hebrews 12:10, located in the previous section of this paper, I mentioned the language of paideia, which also appears in Ephesians 6, 2 Timothy 3:16, and Hebrews 12, which conveys the meaning of upbringing, training, instruction, discipline, and correction. This seems to be a promising avenue for thinking the connection between development, growth, and holiness in 12:10. Furthermore, the perfect passive participle gegimenasmenos is used in 12:11 to describe the positive results of paideia as a fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Curiously, the same verb gymnazo appears in passages that Peterson himself indicates as examples of a spiritual growth in the New Testament, namely 1 Timothy 4:7 and Hebrews 5:14. The difference is that for Peterson, these passages are examples that growth is distinct from the language of sanctification in the New Testament. But in Hebrews 12:7-11, growth and holiness seem to be intimately connected. While a proper treatment of this discussion goes beyond the scope of this paper, this discussion does serve the purpose to vigorously illustrate that in Hebrews, the concept of sanctification has both complete and incomplete aspects, as both approach it from the standpoint of the dimension of time. The epistle strongly emphasizes that believers have been sanctified by Christ's sacrificial offering. On the other hand, believers are warned against the danger of profaning the blood by which they were sanctified. Furthermore, they are informed that God trains, disciplines believers in difficult situations so that they may share in His holiness. Then, they are encouraged to pursue holiness and avoid defilement. Therefore, a balanced account of Christ's priesthood and the sanctification of believers must take into account these complete and incomplete aspects. Thank you.